All right, good morning. How's everybody? That good. Really, it's Monday, I know. Did anyone else see our little like rain and hail that we had on Saturday? My daughter was playing softball and it started hailing like mid-game up in See at Big Sky. Like it's kind of an eventful day, and I burned myself really badly. I feel like I've been limping today. I got this like massive burn on my leg. My partner's car, it burned me, right? Anyway, totally interesting weather. Now it's going to warm up again and cold again. I don't know. We were supposed to get all this rain and it didn't happen. It was really sad that we didn't get all that rain that was promised to us on like Thursday night and Friday. Yeah.
Funny part is that on one part of Simi, it was completely rainy
Yeah.
and drizzling,
Yeah.
and then the other part of Simi was completely dry.
Isn't that strange? So wild. And then literally felt like it was one cloud. Like there was this one huge cloud and it rained a little bit and that was it. It was bizarre weather for us, but you know. A couple of things before I forget. If you were looking at your syllabus, so we're supposed to have a guest speaker, and they're coming on the day they were scheduled, which is fantastic. But I just wanted to give you a heads up about it. So on Wednesday, we'll have a guest speaker in class, so we'll all still meet here. I'll be here and everything as well. But we'll have a guest speaker who's going to come in and talk about suicide prevention. It's called QPR. It's an actual training that they've abbreviated down for our classes. You get a little certificate for having come to it. You can put it on like a resume or an application, which is kind of neat. Anything you can put on an application, right, is helpful. But we'll have somebody coming in from our health center to talk about suicide prevention, which will relate to chapter 7. So I'm not going to be covering chapter 7. She's going to be highlighting some things from it. The slides are, of course, posted on here for chapter 7, and make sure that you read the chapter in the book and everything. But what we'll do today is we'll wrap up the little bit that we have left in mood disorders, and then we'll move on to eating disorders, but she's going to jump in and talk about chapter 7 on Wednesday. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. I know that can be kind of a difficult topic, right? Suicidality and suicide prevention is something that can be a little emotional. I imagine a lot of you have known someone who's either maybe thought about suicide or attempted or even completed it. But please try and be here if you can. She does approach it from like more of like a, you know, more of an information standpoint than an emotional side. But if you can be here, I would love you to benefit from that in multiple ways. And it'll also be something that might be on the exam. So worst case, if you can't be here, we'll record it and you'll be able to hear her voice. But other than that, please try and be here if you can. The other thing I want to mention, and I mentioned this before, but I just want to keep putting it on your mind. If you're looking again at your syllabus, that second part of the paper is due next Wednesday. So a week from Wednesday. So I just want to make sure that you are thinking about it, see if you have any questions about it. But I'm going to write it up here for a minute. Paper part 2 is due on Wednesday, 3/16 on Canvas by 11:59 p.m. You're going to be posting it here on Canvas. So if you're on there under modules, here's the link right here, all the way down at the bottom for paper part 2. And you'll notice it's worth 40 points, right? So you definitely want to make sure that you spend some time on it. It's kind of like a rough draft. It can be in a variety of formats. More than the formatting, I'm worried about content. So what I see a lot from people is that they'll have like a paragraph written, or maybe another paragraph written, and then they have some bulleted thoughts, you know, and it can be kind of in a mixed format like that. That's totally fine. But I'm looking to see that you're making some progress toward your final paper. It should be roughly like 2 to 3 pages long, and 10 points of the 40 is your source. So you're really needing to pick a source, which was the point of that library presentation that you watched. So the source is worth 10 points of the 40. Now, if you don't give me an academic source, you'll get partial credit, but every single one of you could use the DSM or a journal article or a book other than our textbook. So be thinking about what source you could use for your paper. You only need one, but you're welcome to use more than one. Right. So if you really want to use something that isn't academic, make sure you also have an academic source and you can kind of combine them. But again, this could be the DSM, an article, a journal, something that you find in a journal or a book, but it should be an academic source, which Danielle from the library went over quite a bit in her little video. And then the rest of the 30 points are going to be your progress towards your final paper. So I'm looking to see that maybe you have some thoughts about diagnoses or some examples from your show or your film, things that you're maybe thinking for causes or treatment. I've given you a little bit of a kind of more information here, but make sure you have the citation information from your source in any format. It doesn't need to be APA, and then some progress towards your final paper. And I had somebody ask me in my other class, can I change my character? Definitely. This would be a good time to do it before you do part 2, right? Because once you've done this and you've done all this work, you can still change it, but it just makes more work for you. So if you thought of someone else between now and when you did the initial part, you can definitely change it. That's totally fine. But after this, it definitely creates more work for you. So now would be a good time if you were thinking of changing your character. And I want to point out, like, so again, you'll submit it on here up at the top. If I go to student view, up at the top, you'll click on start assignment, and then you can upload the file just like you did for the first part on here. But there's a couple of resources on the modules tab that might be helpful for you. And they're up here more toward the top. So here's the full paper instructions. Here's some sample papers. People who turned in great papers in the past. I've put a few of them on here that you can look at if you want to see how they formatted it or how they wrote their paper and what that looked like. These are all ones that got an A, and kind of a variety of characters, which I think is fun. And then there's the handout from the Writing Center, some library resources, the PowerPoint slides from the Writing Center. So there's a bunch of little resources up here that may or may not be helpful that I just would like to point out to you. Otherwise, it's all the way, as I said, all the way at the bottom, under the PowerPoint slides. You can see the paper part 2 link. So that'll be due online next Wednesday. You can turn it in earlier if you want, but by next Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. I know I've mentioned it before, but are there any questions about this? Anything that you're confused about, or questions or anything about this that I can answer for you? Again, you don't have to have like a diagnosis yet, but maybe you have a few ideas. You're starting to narrow it down, or some great examples. Maybe you wrote the summary and you want to include that. But a big thing, don't forget to really pick a source and include all the citation information for it that you should hopefully have had from that first. You'll have had the show citation from the first part of the paper, and then you're adding this as well. All right. Any questions? Anything about that? All right. So otherwise, we will go back to where we left off, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew about the guest speaker and that this was on your mind, because it is coming up. And again, I purposefully made that and the second exam before spring break so that you would enjoy your spring break and not have to worry about either of them. But we left off here. We were talking last time about the different mood disorders. We talked a lot about bipolar disorder and the causes and treatments. And again, lithium was one of the most common treatments that we tend to use for bipolar disorder. Very, very common mood stabilizing drug. And I had a video and a song that I wanted to play for you, but I just didn't want to run right up against the clock. So I'll start with that here, and then we could talk about it just a little bit afterward. But the song I want to play for you is Lithium by Evanescence. Nirvana also wrote a song called Lithium, but it's not quite as good as this one anyway, at least for talking about the drug. But I want you, as you listen to this song, watch the video, because I think the video is very visually depicting of like her battle with this drug. But listen to the lyrics. And I think she does a beautiful job in this song of talking about some of the struggles that a lot of people experience with mood stabilizing drugs like lithium, right? It can, you figure if it's taking the highs and bringing them down and the lows and bringing them up, a lot of people feel like they lose a little bit of who they are when they're on the medication. And so I think she does a good job of singing about that and some battles that she has with the drug. So we'll listen to the song, and then I'll have you talk about it for a minute or two before we move on. But let me bring that up here so I can play it for you. All right. Okay. Let me turn off the light so you can see it. here we go. Sorry if you have that stuck in your head all day and you don't want it there, but I think it is again a really good like depiction of somebody's battle with taking this drug. It tends to have some kind of upsides and downsides to it. So I want to give you just like 2 minutes, right? A couple people around you, whatever's convenient, 2, 3, 4 people. What are some of the things like she's been struggling with the drug, or relationship with the drug? Just talk about it for a minute or two, and then we can talk about it together. But any thoughts or reactions either from the video or the lyrics? So find a couple of people and just chat about it for a minute, and then we will talk together.
Like gold and like not like yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
So I have a problem.
I always have water. Always. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
All right, so let's talk about it together really quick, and then we can move on. But I heard a lot of people mentioning like little things that I think are really so good messages that she has in this song. Anyone willing to share like a thought that you talked about as a group? Like what is she saying about this drug, or a battle that she's having with it? What are any thoughts? Anyone willing to jump in? Yeah, thank you.
So it's pretty hard for me personally to hear the lyrics.
Yeah.
But I heard one of the lines, "Don't want to lock me up inside." There's also a lot of cold imagery, which usually, like personally, I think it's used to like represent in media the loss of like emotion, or like very low emotions. And she's also like descending into a dark pool, just probably like a void of emotion or something like that. She's like losing herself. That's what I would say.
These are great things to pick up on. Like, that's fantastic, right? So even struggling to think of the lyrics, I love it, right? Like, there's a lot of darkness. She's transcending into like either a void or like drowning in the water. Like, I think visually, it's a very like great depiction as well. That's fantastic. Anyone else? Anything else that you picked up on or was meaningful to you? Yeah.
They seem to be by themselves the entire time. Like
Mhm.
even if it showed multiple people doing multiple things, they were always just by themselves. It wasn't like a group. They were wherever they were located, it was them singularly being there.
Okay.
And she seemed, another part was that she seemed to be like sinking lower, but it like a certain amount of time. Like it wasn't like a constant, like I don't know, it wasn't like an instant, her head was just under the water. It was like a slow
Sure.
descent. So it wasn't like a fast-paced thing, probably. Like I know drugs personally, like when you start a new drug, it takes a while to get accustomed to it. The side effects and everything, that probably takes time as well.
Mhm.
So it's probably like she didn't start out this way, and I'm not blaming the drug and I'm not blaming the diagnosis. I don't know what it is, but
Yeah.
it was over time.
All right. I love that, right? That you were saying it was like kind of a slow descent, right? Like a slow progression, and then like the loneliness maybe, or the isolation as well, right? It's a very like, it's mostly like her in the dark alone, right? Anybody else? Any other thoughts or lyrics that jumped out at you? I mean, that's fantastic so far. I'm not analyzing the lyrics and analyzing poetry, not my skill. My partner teaches English. I leave that to her, right? And that's like the wonderful thing and the horrible thing about like music, right? You can take it in so many different ways. I'm such a concrete person that I'm like, tell me what it means. But at the same time, I love that you can have that openness to interpretation, as long as it's not pressure, right? Then I love it. But I think that she does a wonderful job of like singing about like not wanting to forget how it feels without it, not wanting to be locked inside of it, like the battle that she has with this medication. A lot of people feel that way on medications like lithium, almost like a numbness that can come with it, because you're taking the extremes of your emotion and mellowing them out so much that sometimes people feel like a zombie, or they feel numb, like they've lost a sense of who they are on medications like this. And so as helpful as it might be, it can also have some downsides as well. And I think she does a good job of capturing some of that struggle in that song. Yeah. Yeah.
Right in your system to make of like let's say cleaning that children. And so when medication kind of stops, then it's like, well, that's not my natural self. Like my brain is all trying to figure out how to like balance this out. So
Yeah, no, I love that. It's like trying to figure out, well, then who am I now? And like, how am I going to deal with things now? And how am I going to react now if I'm on a totally different level of reaction than I was before? And I think she kind of thinks about that a little bit too. And again, there are other songs about lithium, but I think hers is the most like symbolically and literally meaningful. So I just wanted to play that for you. And again, I'm sorry if you have it stuck in your head all day. Maybe something will replace it later, hopefully. But this unit, as I said, mood disorder is very, very common for people. And as we talked about previously, a lot of you know people who struggle with them. And I think they have been even more prevalent these last couple of years, just with everything that we've gone through, like as a society and as a culture, as a world, really, these last 2 years. So any last like thoughts, any other thoughts, questions, stories, comments, anything related to mood disorders before we leave them behind? We'll kind of come up again on Wednesday when she's doing her guest speaking, but otherwise we'll move on. Okay. Yeah.
Wait, I don't know if anyone else did it. Did I understand correctly when you mentioned relationships? Was she talking about like in the beginning of having trouble expressing true feelings for another person? Or was she talking about something else?
I mean, I think you could take it though. Interestingly, you could take the whole song as singing about like her relationship with the drug, like not wanting to be alone. Like you could take that as literally meaning like alone, or literally meaning not wanting to not have that drug, and almost the drug being a company for her. I think you could take that in multiple ways. So you could find meaning in that for sure. I think there is some like profound meaning in that the drug might almost even be company in a way, like a coping company that she has for her struggles. All right. So we will move from here. As I said, we'll move on to chapter 9, a little bit out of order, but that's okay. They're all still, I think, within a realm of connection that works. But we'll spend a couple of days talking about eating disorders with a mild interruption in the middle, right, to talk about suicidality. But if we look at chapter 9, which we'll go to next, we'll look at the 3 main eating disorders. There are 2 big ones, and then another one that was added a few years ago. So we'll talk about anorexia, bulimia, and then also binge eating disorder, which is the 3rd one. And then we'll look at some causes and treatments. So that's what we'll focus on for the next couple of days. And eating disorders, as the name implies, right, are a group of disorders in which there is a significant disturbance in eating. Right, with these disorders, with all 3 of them that we'll talk about, a person is eating or refusing to eat in order to satisfy like a psychological or psychic need more than a physical one. So you hit a point where you're not listening to bodily signals. Maybe you're eating despite the fact that you're full and you feel like you can't stop. Or you're super hungry, but you don't eat because you don't want to gain weight for eating something. You start to ignore bodily signals, and it can even reach a point where you're no longer aware of them because it's something that's so prevalent for you. And these are also relatively common and difficult to treat, because think how often we have to eat food, right, in order to survive. We need food in order to survive, but food is so much more complicated than just physical hunger. Food can be incredibly complicated. Super easy example. How many of you, by show of hands, eat when you're bored? I can like put a big hand up to that one, right? Okay, eat when you're happy. right? To celebrate, go out to eat to celebrate something good happening. And always, anytime something good happens, we go out to food or I get a cake, right? Cakes in my family. I bought a cake last week from the bakery at Vaughn's. They know me well in there. And she's like, what are we celebrating? I was like, it's Tuesday. You know, like, why not, right? It's Tuesday. Life is short. Have cake, right? That could be my motto. But well, food can be complicated. We go out to eat to celebrate something good, right? Maybe we eat when we're bored, eat when we're stressed. Anyone stress eating, right? I do that all the time. Or when I'm grading, I will mindlessly eat and see that like all of a sudden I'm rooting around in the bag and there are no more goldfish in it. I've eaten the whole bag because I was grading and eating mindlessly. Oftentimes we eat as part of like rituals or celebrations. I won't go to a movie unless there's popcorn. Like, why bother going to see a movie in the theater if there's no food, right? But that's just me. Like, everyone can have kind of complicated connections to food. It's not always as simple as like, I eat because I'm hungry or I stop eating because I'm full. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to lose weight or gain weight to be healthier or for like a specific motivation, but it can get a little bit messy, right? Like oftentimes people will lose weight to increase their health in some way. I've been on a diet for like 5 months now because I have really high blood pressure and I don't want to go on blood pressure medication. Like as a side note, I've lost 28 pounds. I'm very proud of myself. That is a lot of work. No, yeah, you don't have to clap for me, but thank you. Like, incredible amount of work because I love food so much, but I don't want to be on blood pressure medication the rest of my life. So it's kind of a weighing of options. A lot of people gain weight to maybe help them be stronger, have more muscle mass, or for a specific reason. But we can have some problematic patterns that develop with food that can lead to more problems down the line, right? And so again, my point with this is that it's not always as simple as, you know, we eat when we're hungry and we stop when we're full. There can be a lot of other factors that do play a role. And I have a little part of like a video that I want to play for you. There's a lot of great documentaries about eating disorders. Interesting film on Netflix, Right to the Bone. If you've seen, that's probably the newest one. But I have a 7-minute excerpt from a documentary called Thin. That was one of the like more prevalent ones that came out a handful of years back. And we have it in the library if you ever wanted to watch the whole thing. But I think it does a beautiful job of introducing what this can look like if you've never known anyone who has an eating disorder. So I'm going to play that for you just as an introduction, and then we'll talk about the actual disorders after that. And this focuses on young women in like a residential treatment center, but this definitely affects men as well. It doesn't just have to be women, though it's much more prevalent in women than in men. Pause this element to what this looks like. And again, it's very specific in this documentary to young girls and teenage girls, but this can affect anyone, right? It does affect women much more than men, but it can affect anyone. And I think it does a good job of showing that distorted body image that we'll talk a little bit about, the refusal to eat out of fear of gaining weight. And then there's some of the like binging and purging stuff as well that we'll talk about when we get to bulimia. So if you haven't known somebody who struggles with this, you know, that's some of the intensity and the thoughts and the things going on, just to give you a little bit of that perspective. So I imagine a lot of you have known somebody who struggles with an eating disorder. And there's sometimes we refer to it as people can have an eating disorder or they can have disordered eating, right? There's a little bit of a difference there. Like oftentimes people have problematic patterns with food that may or may not escalate. Or like I just shared with you all of my like complicated things that I have connected with food. Like it hasn't escalated to something worse, but it could. Right? Sometimes people have complicated relationships with food that could be on the road to a disorder, but they never progress. And other times people have, you know, issues with food that are very disordered. And it's obviously, you know, a big spectrum. So what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the symptoms for these. The first disorder that we'll talk about is anorexia, or anorexia nervosa, we go with the full name. So it's a quick overview, and then we'll look at the symptoms. This is an eating disorder associated with an intense fear of weight gain and also a distorted body image. So there's kind of this pursuit of extreme thinness, wanting to lose weight, being afraid to eat anything because you fear if you eat something, you will gain weight from it. And then there's that very distorted body image that tends to come with it. So some of the symptoms that you have to have in order to be diagnosed with anorexia. The first one, you have a refusal to maintain a normal body weight for your height and age. Now, normal, incredibly subjective, right? Like, what does normal mean? There are all sorts of growth charts used by like the medical profession to indicate for your height and age what weight range you should be in. But in order to qualify it a little bit better, we say less than 85% of your expected weight. So by definition, somebody who has anorexia is underweight, right? Less than 85% of the weight that they should be at for their height and for their age. The second criterion in order to have this diagnosis is there's an intense fear of gaining weight. And this fear is so intense that it leads to really restrictive eating habits, right? Like really, really under eating, ignoring the fact that you're hungry and not eating enough food or like enough nutrients in order to feel full ever. There's just this intense fear of gaining weight. So you restrict yourself very, very heavily, and you oftentimes tend to eat very, very little as a result. Right, so a lot of restrictive eating, obsession around food, maybe you know the calories that are in everything, and you're very, very aware and conscious of that, and restricting yourself because you don't want to gain weight from anything that you consume. The last criteria is there's a disturbance in, how do I want to abbreviate this? Let's say your view of your body. Or we could say an undue influence of weight on self-evaluation. I'll explain what that means. So people who have anorexia typically have a disturbance in their view of their body, right? Or an undue influence of weight on their self-evaluation. So your whole worth, your self-esteem, how you view yourself, how much like value you feel like you have as a person has an undue influence of weight, right? So you're using your weight as like the one metric to decide like how good or bad you feel about yourself. It's very distorted. Think about the young woman in the clip who she drew a picture of herself on the wall and then they traced her, right? And her frame was so much smaller than the image that she, like the drawing that she did of herself. And then she wrote stuff like need to tone, abdominoplasty, help, right, on different parts of her body. There's often a very like distorted view of how you see yourself, right? Like someone who's incredibly thin looks in the mirror and sees himself as heavier, right? And so you're not really seeing yourself as you are, and you're using your weight to decide how much worth you have as an individual. And again, this disorder is very, very common. But anyone know people, or yourself or people in your lives, any stories or comments or anything, people that you know, or what this can look like? Or yeah.
I actually used to struggle with like bulimia because I was a wrestler.
Okay.
And like it was like ingrained. You have to be a certain weight.
Yeah.
And like I became like really obsessed with it. But then I like went to treatment for it in like high school.
It's tricky when you have to be in a certain weight class for like wrestling, boxing, dancing. There's so many different things that require like a certain frame or weight. And it gets tricky. It could be like an isolated thing just so I can meet that criteria, or it could develop into something more. A lot of people have those issues, right? Of like, I need to gain weight or lose weight in order to be able to participate in something, right? There was another hand. Yeah.
There's a friend in my class, who was in my class last year, and it was distance learning. So she had to like Zoom the classes from a hospital, because she had like almost starved herself to death. And one time, the feeding tube, I don't know, fell out or something, and she had to call the nurse because it was, you know.
Right, yeah, I mean, and like it can have a lot of medical consequences. Some of the women who describe that, women describe that, you're not getting your menstrual cycle, your hair falling out, teeth falling out. I mean, when you don't get enough nutrients because you're not eating, it can sometimes have consequences. You can end up hospitalized or even in like a treatment center like you saw in the video clip. Anybody else, other people in your life or any other stories or thoughts or anything? Yeah.
My mom had anorexia, so I grew up with that.
Yeah.
She would always say, this makes me sick, or just food that was too fatty, she'd always think that it would make her sick. And then, so after I had a kid, she was always on my case about losing weight, and she'd be like, oh, you'll be gonna check your back to your normal weight.
Sure.
So she kind of tried to project it on me.
Very common, right? And the messages that people say to us play a big role in how we view ourselves, right? Whether with eating disorders and just with anything. And we'll talk about that more probably next week, right? How those messages can be difficult, right? Like, you'll feel better about yourself. You need to lose the weight and stuff like that. And they tend to take a toll on us over time. And I grew up with a mom who had anorexia as well. And like for her, like if she went over 99 pounds, that was like her number she had in her head. Like if she weighed 100 pounds, she was overweight, right? So she always weighed under 100 pounds. And I remember as a kid thinking that she would blow away in the wind because she was so thin. Like I remember being afraid that she'd like Mary Poppins style, like take off on a windy day, right? Like don't hold an umbrella, because she was so frail and skinny all the time, right? And then there's those messages that it was just always get of, are you really going to eat that? You don't need to eat that. And that stuff can, again, take a toll on us. Yeah.
What would happen when the person itself just like has like a strong dislike for food? Like it's not even like the weight loss and intention, because my mom, before she had me, she had a strong dislike for food, so that's why she had experienced extreme weight loss, but it was not with being thin, with not that just happened to me. Sure, maybe say like a side done. So what would that be?
So, I mean, that might be a medical thing, right? And sometimes that happens where people have food aversions or like food just doesn't hold an appeal. Maybe they're sick and like they, or like with COVID, you lose your sense of smell and all of a sudden food doesn't hold an appeal anymore than it did before, right? Just the motivation here is more like the pursuit of thinness. So the motivation matters, right, when it comes to eating disorders. And so if it's not motivated by, wanting to be thin or like that distorted body image, it's more like food doesn't taste good and it makes you feel sick, then that might be somewhat problematic, but it technically wouldn't fit those like criteria because of the like main motivation behind it. So it's tricky, like it's almost never super black and white. Right? There's a lot of gray with disorders, period, and eating disorders especially. So I'm not sure if it would fit or not. You'd have to look at like the big picture, but it doesn't sound quite, like it quite fits here, right? Any other thoughts or questions or comments or anything? A couple of other pieces of information. So like I said, it just tends to affect women more than men. And the most common age range is 14 to 18 years old, right? That it tends to start. 14 to 18-year-old women, but this can obviously affect men as well. It can affect anyone, right? But it tends to be more prevalent in young women. Yeah.
What would happen if like someone was overweight, but they still had like restrictive patterns, so they would like starve themselves?
Yeah.
Do something, but like, and like in the pursuit of fitness,
Yeah.
but they still like didn't get under the 85% body weight. What would that?
That's a great question, right? And that's a lot of people, right? A lot of people have like these restrictive dieting habits, but they don't meet that criteria of being underweight. And so with every group, and we haven't really talked about this, but with every group of disorders, there's always a disorder that's called NOS, not otherwise specified. And so there'd be eating disorder not otherwise specified, mood disorder not otherwise specified, anxiety not otherwise, every disorder group has that. And so we tend to use that as like this person clearly has, some problems with eating, and it clearly has an eating disorder, but doesn't fit the criteria for anorexia or bulimia perfectly. And that's a lot of people, right? Maybe you've had years and years where, you have these criteria, but you don't meet the criteria to be overweight. Or maybe you've been kind of more anorexic and restricted, and then all of a sudden you start binging and purging, and you have both going. So you probably would diagnose that person, if they were diagnosable, but they, as eating disorder not otherwise specified, meaning that they have problematic patterns, they don't fit neatly into one of those 2 or 3 categories. It's a great question, and that exists with every disorder group that we cover. But a lot of people don't fit these perfectly. Like we change, we're dynamic, we don't always fit all the criteria, which is why everything is kind of on a little bit of a spectrum. Okay? So again, much more common in women than in men. Sometimes we see an interesting variant of this in men. And this can be in women as well, but it's more common to men, that oftentimes the norms of beauty for masculinity are to be bigger and stronger. So sometimes we see men like bulking up and getting more and more muscular and stronger to try and fit those norms of beauty and attractiveness. And it's kind of like an opposite of this in a way, but it's called muscle dysmorphia. I won't ask you that, but just as a side note, sometimes we see it present differently in men and women. So that's a really overly simplistic, right? It just tends to appear more in women because of the norms of beauty for women, but it can appear in anyone. Anyone can struggle with anorexia. So this one again, really restrictive eating, underweight, distorted body image. The other big eating disorder, there are 2 main ones. So there is a third, but these are the 2 big ones. Erase this. And I could leave, this also affects women in the same age range most prominently. But bulimia has a slightly different pattern, right? And sometimes it's called binge purge syndrome because of the pattern that we see with it. So with this one, we have an eating disorder where people binge and then they do something afterward to compensate so that they don't gain weight. So we have binge eating, and then compensatory behaviors to avoid weight gain. Okay, so the criteria for this one is the first, you have recurrent episodes of binge eating. So recurrent episodes of binge eating, and how we define binge eating kind of gets added to this a little bit. There is a lack of control during the binge, right? So oftentimes you feel like you can't stop. You just keep eating and eating. You might be uncomfortably full, but you keep eating anyway. There's almost like a lack of control or a lack of an ability to stop eating. And then we say eating within, this is super subjective, but eating within a 2-hour period of time, more than most would eat. Now that is incredibly subjective. Now what I could eat in 2 hours versus maybe what you could eat in 2 hours are probably very different, right? Like we all have a norm of how much we can eat and what's comfortable for us. But in general, it's eating a large amount of food within a short period of time, right? And sometimes this is done in secret or in hiding, right? Like closet eating, we sometimes refer to, you know what I'm trying to say, right? Refer to that as, but within a 2-hour period of time, eating a lot of food and a lack of ability to stop, often eating to the point of being uncomfortably full. But again, there's a lot of subjectivity in what most would eat, right? So it's the idea is just that you're eating beyond the point of fullness and more than is kind of expected or average. I guarantee every single one of you has binged at some point in your life. That doesn't mean you have an eating disorder. Binge eating occasionally isn't problematic, right? Like maybe you would like eat way too much one day. Like on Halloween, I binge every year, right? I eat way too much candy, but it's isolated to that day, or maybe I could say that month, the month of October. So you have to look at like the behaviors around it. How long is it lasting? Is it happening once or twice, or is it happening repeatedly? When it becomes a cycle that's happening repeatedly, it's a little bit different than like, an occasional event that might happen. A couple other things, there's compensatory behavior. To prevent waking. So you eat a whole bunch of food in a binge period, and then you compensate for it by doing various things to keep you from gaining weight. What are some of the ways that people might compensate for a binge? What are some of the compensatory behaviors that maybe someone might engage in? Yeah. Yeah, right. So you ate a bunch of food and then you literally removing it. All right, that's definitely a great example. What else might somebody do to avoid gaining weight? Yeah. Yeah, by using laxatives to eliminate it out of your system so you don't absorb it and gain weight from it. Anything else? There's like 2 more really big ones that people do. Yeah. What was that? Purging, like vomiting, making yourself throw up. Very, very common. She mentions Ipecac. That's a medication that you can sometimes use to make yourself vomit. It's traditionally used for like poison control, but people abuse it. There's one more that tends to be common that people can do. Anyone, any other guesses? How else you could keep yourself from gaining weight if you ate way too much food? Yeah. Yeah, excessive exercise. All right, so somebody who then maybe works out for hours and hours and hours to avoid gaining weight from what they just consumed. So some kind of compensation or compensatory behavior to keep yourself from gaining weight from all the food that you just ingested. The binges and compensatory behaviors. I'm going to abbreviate this as compensatory behaviors occur on average. You have to have them occur at least 2 times a week for a minimum of 3 months. So again, this is very cyclical. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a 2-time thing. This is somebody who on average 2 times a week for at least 3 months. Now it's on average much, much more than this, right? Traditionally, it's more like 10 times a week. You see that a lot with bulimia, but at least 2 times a week for at least 3 months. So binges and compensatory behaviors occur on average twice a week for 3 months or more. So not short-lived, but a longer lasting pattern. And then finally, D is the same. The same as the last one, your self-evaluation is unduly influenced by weight. So just like with anorexia, right, your self-evaluation, your self-worth is very much connected to your weight. And there doesn't always have that distorted body image, but that can often be something that's part of it as well. But this one is a little more cyclical, right? And there's like an element of conditioning and reinforcement that comes with it. I ate all this food, I got to feel full, but then I got rid of it so I didn't gain any weight. And it becomes this pattern that people get into that can be difficult to break. And again, a lot of people binge at some point. You might have even like eliminated food that you ate at some point through one of these compensatory behaviors, but only when it becomes a pattern and it's happening in a reoccurring way do we start to worry that it is a disorder. Now, as we talked about, like your example and like other examples, there are a lot of motivations behind eating and behind weight loss and behind all these things, right? And I want to show you a clip of something that I think is really like fascinating. And I want you to be thinking about, do you think these people have an eating disorder or not? Or are you maybe worried about them developing one? Like, where are you at with it? And it's competitive eating, right? There's a lot of really interesting, like people who eat competitively for a living, people who eat on social media to get money and attention. I mean, it's just wild the things that people do to get like bits on Twitch or like money and subscriptions on YouTube. Like it's wild. I have a friend who likes to watch other people eat when she eats because she doesn't like to eat alone. Like, so she puts on YouTube and watches other people eating so she doesn't have to eat by herself. I'm like, just call me, I'll come eat with you. But I mean, it's just, there's so much of it on social media. But the one I want to show you is a group of people competing in a hot dog eating competition. This may make you never want hot dogs again. Maybe not. But I want to play this for you and just be thinking as you watch it, do you think, I don't think I could eat 66 hot dogs in a year. Right? You could give me a year and I couldn't do that. But I mean, I haven't trained for that. These guys train, and like men and women, like train to do this. I mean, what do you think? I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer necessarily, but I mean, do you think they have an eating disorder or not? Like, where are you at as you watch that? Does anyone have a thought or an opinion? Lean toward yes, lean toward no? What do you think? Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely like the binge eating, but I can't specify if they have specific like bulimia. Obviously, they don't have anorexia. But I can't specify if they have bulimia because it doesn't show what happens afterwards. Like,
Yeah.
how do they purge it out? Do they
Mhm.
just sit with it and let it settle in their stomachs, or do they really do to go to the bathroom? What do they do?
A lot of them do vomit afterward, like they make themselves like throw it up so that they don't, because they can't hold on to that much food. They can't do it within the time frame, but a lot of them do it afterward. But I think we can agree that they're definitely eating, I mean, within, what was it, a 12-minute period of time, more than most would eat, right? But like you said, we don't see the whole picture. Anyone else? What do you think? Yeah.
I think it depends on, well, there's a lot of social factors in this because like
Yeah.
you're getting probably paid if they win, right?
Yeah.
And there's like a certain competition element to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is an isolated event in that sense, but it depends on what their eating habits are like over time, right?
Okay.
If they're doing this, I mean, honestly, they could be training to do it, which could be a disorder in some way.
Sure.
But the way that they're going about it, it isn't necessarily impacting them in a way that's like unhealthy, because I think that's something necessarily that they're choosing to do as opposed to like an issue. And so it's actually pretty unique. It's kind of weird.
Okay, it is unique and a little strange to
Yeah.
watch, right? I mean, most people don't eat hot dogs that way at all, right? But the motivations behind it are a little bit more complicated, right? They do make a lot of money. There's a lot of like fame that comes with that. Like competitive eating is a whole circuit. There's a whole culture of competitive eating. So those things need to weigh in, right? They need to have a place in our deciding on that. Anybody else? Any other thoughts at all? Yeah.
Well, part of the criteria, right, was like the self-evaluation of somebody
Unduly influenced by weight. Mhm.
And so I guess that makes me think that it's not, because if that is how you think about yourself and your body,
Sure.
then I wouldn't think that you would go into that.
Mhm. Okay.
That these competitions, I don't think you would ever do it completely avoid that.
All right. So kind of thinking about that last criteria a little bit. If I made you choose, I'm gonna give you three options. I'll let you, I'll give you one kind of in the middle, right? So option one would be, I think these people have an eating disorder. Option two, I think they don't have an eating disorder. And option three, like, I don't know, maybe they could be on the road to it. I'm kind of in the middle, right? So how many would say, yes, they have an eating disorder? Like for sure. Nobody. How about no for sure? Oh, I gave you too much of a gray area. How about number three? Like, you're not sure, right? Right? I gave you too much in the middle. The kid, my kids made fun of me because they threw like this. I held up three and then I wanted to do this. But I broke each wrist twice, so I can't do three like that. And it's like I'm like trying to scratch you. Three. Yeah, I think that they're kind of in the middle. These people train so much of the whole documentary that Purge. Really interesting. I mean, the guy is ripped. Like his metabolism is through the roof. He works out excessively, he trains all the time, but you can't deny that they do like make themselves throw up. Oftentimes from this, they're eating an incredible amount of food from this. So there's a lot of factors in play, but where do we draw the line? And it's the same, like if you're trying to lose weight or gain weight for like an event or a competition or a sport, like it can get a little bit blurry. So it's rarely black and white. And the motivation again is huge. I once competed in a pie eating competition. I took second. I was very proud of myself. I ate 9 chocolate cream pies and I hate pie. Right? Like as I threw it out, I got sick, right? Like 9 chocolate cream pies. And like, if you show me a chocolate cream pie, I'm just like, no, like I can't. Like it ruined it for me. Thankfully not cake, but pie. right? And so there can be consequences for these things. Maybe it could be become a problem, but like I did that event because it was like a social competition in college. I was like, I can do this. I can put down pie. Let's do this, right? It was just like a social thing, and it was a one-time event. I mean, these people do it repeatedly, but the motivations behind it are a little bit different than maybe we might see with a traditional eating disorder. So again, it's not always so clear, but there are a lot of cases where people have maybe slightly disordered eating, but we wouldn't say they have an eating disorder quite yet. And so just, again, there can be a lot of like warning signs, but it doesn't always mean somebody has that disorder. Any other like comments or stories or thoughts or anything else here before we keep going? Okay. So there's one more disorder, and it's very similar, but it's missing a piece. And I put the criteria up here on the slide for this one. But binge eating disorder is when people binge, but they don't purge. There's no purging behavior associated with this, at least not consistently. So oftentimes with this, people do gain a lot of weight, right? If you're binging, but you're not purging it, you're going to gain weight from it, right? Typically, not always. But so with this one, we have frequent bingings, but no compensatory behaviors, or no like reoccurring compensatory behaviors. So what we see here is that people who have this disorder oftentimes engage in a lot of eating, like unusually rapid eating. So again, eating a lot of food in a short period of time, eating without hunger, right? So oftentimes you're not hungry, but you like consume massive amounts of food anyway, or eat until you're uncomfortably full. This is often done in private. Right? So this is often something that people do alone because they're embarrassed about it, right? Or they might avoid eating in front of other people so that other people don't see this. There can be a lot of feelings of self-disgust or depression or guilt that people can feel after these episodes of binge eating, but they don't get rid of the food in any way. So it's again, binging without the purging. It has to occur on average at least once a week for 3 months with no pattern of inappropriate compensatory behaviors. Now, I told you all about Kim, right? Kim, who has Munchausen's, right? Kim used to weigh about 400 pounds back when I knew her. We haven't talked to her in or her like family in, I want to say 10 years at this point. But when I first met Kim, she weighed like 380, maybe 400 pounds, really, really large, like overweight for her size and like frame and everything. But she was such a like closet eater. I never saw her eat anything. Like she never ate. We'd go out to eat in a restaurant and she would order like very little food. Right? And we'd go, she'd have dinner at her house, barely ate anything. But she was such a closet eater. She ate an incredible amount of food on her own. I remember once we watched her house and my partner was like, you got to see this, like, but don't touch anything because she'll know. We went in her closet and she had drawers, like upon drawers of candy bars. And I was like, oh my God, I want it, right? Like it was candy everywhere. I was so like, I want it. She was like, she'll know, don't touch it. Like, but I wanted to show you. You open these drawers and it was just like Snicker bars, candy like all over the place. And she would eat them in private because she didn't want anyone to see that behavior. It's very common with this disorder, but a lot of that like private alone eating because you were embarrassed about it. And again, it oftentimes does lead to a lot of weight gain because you're not doing anything to compensate for all the food that you've taken in. So, you know, this is something that this is a newer eating disorder. It's traditionally just been the other two, but this one was added in the last DSM to reflect people who have the binging element, but not the purging element. All right. So I think let's stop there. And then on Wednesday, we'll have our QPR guest speaker. And again, I really hope you can be here for that. I think it'd be wonderful for you to get that opportunity and training so you can put it on a resume or an application. And then after that, what we'll do next week is we'll keep going with chapter 9, but we'll switch gears. So make sure you read chapter 7 or look over the slides as that is what we'll be covering on Wednesday. So have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll see you all Wednesday for chapter 7. Stop that.